I want to welcome you to our Diversity Data Deep Dive 7, hosted by the Diversity Community of Practice Assessment Committee, with help from many other partners. This doesn't occur in a vacuum. Lots of people helped put this together. I'd also like to introduce my colleagues, Vic Masalia, Virajita Singh, Shelby Lafreniere, and Amy Barton, all members of the DCoP Assessment Committee and key players in putting together today's program. Today's conference is broken up into morning and afternoon sessions. We're going to explore a number of topics today, including data and insights at the U of M related to public safety and police reform in our community, disability visibility on campus, specifically focused around student mental health, reflection and discussion groups, conducting research through an anti-racism lens, data from a COVID-19 wellness study, and finally, equal opportunity and affirmative action compliance related data. The morning and afternoon sessions are different in content, so we hope you can attend both sessions. Members of the DCoP Assessment Committee will be monitoring chat for any questions or comments that arise. Time permitting, we will do our best to bring those comments and questions to the group, but depending on volume, we may not get to all of them, so please bear with us. Another reminder, please remember to keep yourself muted until you'd like to comment or ask a question. Also, this meeting will be recorded, so if you prefer not to be recorded, please turn off your cameras and pose questions via chat. My introduction went very quickly, much quicker than I thought. So we are a few minutes ahead of schedule. Our first presentation today is from Dr. Michelle Phelps. And Dr. Phelps, if you're ready, we can certainly get started. If not, we can wait a few more minutes.
I'm fine. So really up to you how you want to proceed, but I'm ready to go when you are.
Okay, sounds good. Well, a little bit ahead of schedule is not bad. Let me give you an introduction. First up today is Dr. Phelps, as I indicated, Associate Professor of Sociology at the U of M. Dr. Phelps will be discussing anti-police violence, activism, and community perceptions of the police in Minneapolis to understand how activists, city leaders, and everyday residents frame the problems in policing and their potential and possible solutions. So Dr. Phelps, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for joining us this morning. I'm very relieved to be speaking to you the day after the verdict, as opposed to all of us waiting on tenterhooks to know the outcome of the trial. So thank you very much for making the time. Let me go ahead and get my technology set up. Give me 1 second. Okay, can you guys see those slides in normal slide view? Looking good. Shelby, thank you for the thumbs up. I always appreciate the nodders in the crowd. Okay, so let's see. That'll do that. Okay, perfect. So thank you all again for joining today. I am an associate professor of sociology here at the U. And for the last 5 years, since 2016, I've been working on this project on policing, police reform, anti-police violence activists, and community perceptions of the police in Minneapolis. So it's been a really surreal and heavy year this year, having the kind of country's focus on us and this horrific case of police violence in what we can now all say was the murder of George Floyd. But I am also grateful for the opportunity to be here in a place where we're really thinking about making some big changes, and excited to share some of this work with you all today. What I'm going to present to you today is sort of a sketch of a book manuscript that I'm working on that's going to take a little bit, sort of a slice of each of a couple of the key empirical chapters. So we will be kind of moving between data collection efforts. So I'll be moving pretty quickly through the technical details, but I'm happy to, in the Q&A, answer questions about anything folks are interested in learning more about. So with that preamble, let's get started. Okay, so this project really, you guys see that new slide now, right? That's the last I'll ask about the slides. Okay, terrific. This project grew out of a book that I co-wrote with Joshua Page, who's also here in the social department, and Phil Goodman, who's at the University of Toronto. And Breaking the Pendulum argued that we should think about not these big national level swings in how we think about punishment. So the book really focuses on this pendulum metaphor. Many people have argued that we sort of swing wildly back and forth between more rehabilitative periods and more punitive periods in the history of punishment in the United States. And what we argue in the book is that we need to break that pendulum metaphor because it suggests that there's this naturalistic swinging between these two poles, and instead really focus on what does punishment look like on the ground? Who are the actors who are shaping it? How are they defining crime and the problems that lead to crime and the proper responses to crime? And so as we were finishing up this book, of course, Black Lives Matter movement was starting to explode nationwide. We were seeing solidarity protests here in Minneapolis in 2014. And then in 2015, of course, with the death of Jamar Clark, protests locally against MPD and violence generally, racialized police violence in particular. And so I started to wonder how I could apply the theoretical framework from the book to think about policing, right? So who are the people who are fighting for change in policing? How do they define the problems in policing, and what are their perceived solutions? And what was the relative sort of power differential of people in the field, and who was able to make change or not? And so that really prompted this project. And it started with just a couple of descriptive questions. So using Minneapolis as a case study, I asked, how are police departments responding to the legitimate crisis? Who are the actors fighting for change, and how do they define these problems and solutions? And then how are everyday residents making sense of policing and police reform? And as you all know, as a local audience, this was a period of really deep contestation over policing, although it paled in comparison to what we've seen in the past year in some ways. But just a quick Minneapolis timeline, as I noted before, in 2014, we had the Ferguson Solidarity protest. In 2015, the police department actually was selected as one of 6 sites to be one of the pilots for what was called the National Initiatives on Trust and Reconciliation. And that National Initiatives project comes out of the 21st Century Policing Task Force report that was organized under Obama, that was really meant to be kind of a manual or like kind of guiding principles document for how to think about liberal police reform. So 2015, Minneapolis gets selected as one of the sites for national initiatives reform, but almost immediately as the department starts to do this work of police reform, their officers shoot and kill Jamar Clark in North Minneapolis. They continue the work of the national initiatives, but in the context of this public outcry around police violence. These projects included things like community engagement forums, training on mental health and de-escalation and implicit bias, policy and practice reforms around use of force and misconduct review, more public data on police stops and police violence, stricter body camera policies, procedural justice training, and a mental health co-responder pilot that paired mental health responders with police officers. But of course, as many of you know, this period was also rocked by a continuing series of police killings by Minneapolis Police Department, but also local police departments. So in 2016, of course, Philando Castile is shot and killed in Falcon Heights, not the MPD, but still very, very resonant for folks in Minneapolis, and as I'll talk about for some of the organizers as well. In 2017, Justine Damon is shot and killed by an NPD officer, Noor. And then, of course, in 2020, George Floyd, as I'll talk a little bit about later in the talk. Okay, so this is the context. It's a context in which there's a brewing activism around police violence. There's efforts towards police reform, but there is this continued series of really high profile incidents of police violence by MPD. Okay, so just a quick conceptual framework. There's 2 scholarly conversations that I'm drawing on for this project. The first is the literature around race and policing. So sociologists have talked a lot about race and policing. Black Americans are at a greater risk of involuntary police contact, but also demeaning, abusive, and violent, potentially lethal police interactions. And these interactions are raced, but they're also classed and gendered and place-based, right? And so police violence tends to concentrate in low-income communities of color, where residents often experience both fear of crime and fear of the police. Legal scholar Monica Bell, who's at Yale Law School, argues that this relationship we should describe under the concept of legal estrangement, which is meant to connote the sense of exclusion that residents of poor Black and Brown communities often feel about the police, the law, and the state more generally. And this legal estrangement, it comes from both personal experiences of police mistreatment, but also vicarious experiences and inadequate protection, right, from crime in the community, including slow response times, apathy from responding officers, and a sense that police are failing to prevent violent crime in the community. So I wanted to follow up on this work on legal estrangement to ask not just how legal estrangement shaped attitudes towards the police, but also how they were shaping attitudes towards police reform and how residents in these most impacted communities were thinking about what came next and what they would want to see from a state that responded to their needs adequately at a minimum. And I draw on this literature that's starting to evolve around Black Lives Matter as a contemporary social movement. So the Black Lives Matter rallying cry was developed in 2013 following the acquittal of George Zimmerman for the death of Trayvon Martin, exploded in 2014 into the popular consciousness following the police killing of Michael Brown and the non-indictment of Officer Darren Wilson. But it built not only on earlier civil rights movements around protests for Black liberation, but also years of organized resistance to mass incarceration and criminal justice practices more broadly. And so scholars have increasingly talked about the effects of the movement on public opinion. So white Americans, particularly Democrats, have grown increasingly concerned about police violence and racial inequality during the initial BLM protest years. And Black social movements have grown increasingly organized and focused on both police violence, but anti-Blackness more generally. But less work has examined how these movements have shaped popular opinions qualitatively, really probing people's own experiences of the movement and their attitudes towards police. And then finally, I was interested in this gap between activist diagnoses of the problem in policing and their solutions and how that was filtering down to the community. Kind of, again, what was happening at the level of political discourses versus how everyday residents were processing that and what was actually happening in policy. Okay, so a little bit about the data collection. Well, the data collection began in 2016 and really ramped up in 2017. Most of the interviews I'll be talking to you about today were conducted in 2017 to 2019, that 2-year window. So members of my research team, who I'll introduce in a minute, collected 112 interviews with residents in heavily policed neighborhoods in North Minneapolis. Of that 112 participants for the North Side interviews, 24 identified as white, 75 as Black, and as the remainder as other racial groups and multiracial folks. The interviews asked residents to share their experiences with exposure to violence and police, knowledge of police reforms, attitudes about anti-police violence, activism, and desires for the future of policing. And we picked North Minneapolis because at the time, this was following the death of Jamar Clark, a lot of the activism around Black Lives Matter was focused in North Side, which has historically been the heart of the Black community in Minneapolis. So we really wanted to get at residents most impacted by policing, aggressive street policing, and police violence. In that same time span, 2017 to 2019, I conducted interviews with about 25 Oh, somebody is unmuted and talking in the background. You can figure out who that is. So those folks included activist leaders, organizers, and community and city leaders. So we're really thinking here kind of grass tops of movements. This wasn't sort of everyday protesters who were showing up at protests. This was like people who were organizing those protests, leaders of those activist communities, as well as pivotal city leadership. And those interviews included questions on participants' framing of the problem around policing and police violence, evaluation of MPD relative to other police departments, definitions of accountability in policing and what accountability would mean to them, and barriers to change. And then finally, although I won't talk about it as much in the talk today, we did observations at a number of events, vigils, and public forums. And we also traced the reforms that MPD was actually enacting in this period. The project was actually set to wrap in early 2020. We were coding and analyzing our data. The murder of George Floyd really changed the trajectory of the project. We went back into data collection mode, mostly digital data collection because we were still in the midst of the pandemic, but collecting information on city council hearings, protests and rallies, and activist demands over that they were articulated at events and social media platforms and through online interviews, and then trying to kind of tap into some of the public sentiment by looking at places where the public was asked for feedback on policing and police reform, and more recently, policing transformation and abolition. Okay, so before I go any farther, I just want to highlight my incredible research team. Santino Reynolds here in the upper right corner was an undergraduate who was in my policing class when we got a call that said we needed more applications to the McNair program for summer fellowships in sociology. And Santino said, yeah, let's do some research together. And I said, that sounds great. And Santino actually was the one who said, at the time I had been interviewing activists, and Santino said, I think we really need to hear from residents. Santino had been, had negative experiences with police, had police pull guns on him. He really wanted to get the community's perspective. And so that's what really started that set of interviews. I then had a series of graduate students who came to me and said, I want to do something on policing. I want to get involved in this project. I want to be a part of this. And so Ashley Smith and DeAndre Beadle started doing interviews for the project. We wound up getting a couple of small grants on campus, which I'll list at the end of the slide, but that allowed me to hire Amber Joy Powell full-time as the lead RA on the project. And once Amber was on board, she really took the lead in the Northside interviews. Since then, Chris Robertson has come on board on the project, also funded on one summer with another small pocket of money on campus to help us with the analysis and writing up the papers. And Annalise Ward, who was one of our undergraduate students, is helping to analyze the activist interviews with me and is working on a paper from that. So this was very much a team effort with both undergraduate and graduate students from our university. Okay, so the outline of the talk today. So first I want to start by kind of mapping out the activist scene, how these different activist groups were formed, and the splits and divides that started to emerge within the activist community. Second, I want to talk about support in the community, how community members were processing this increasing activism. Again, both of those are going to take us up to 2019 and stop at 2019, so the pre-George Floyd era. And then I want to talk about what happened since last summer and the efforts to really reimagine policing in the city. Okay, so part one, activists. So there are a number of long-time and more recent activist groups fighting to change policing in Minneapolis. Many of these groups emerge in response to very specific instances of lethal police violence. So the oldest or most long-running at this point anti-police violence group in the Twin Cities or in Minneapolis is CUAPB, which stands for Communities United Against Police Brutality. They were formed in 2000. And in contrast to many of the BLM and post-BLM groups that emerged, CUAPB is notable for being helmed by retirement-aged white organizers, including Michelle Gross, who's in this photo here. She's standing right in front of Makima. BLM Minneapolis, as I said earlier, emerges in 2015 to organize solidarity protests with Ferguson, and they're really ready to lead street mobilizations in the wake of Clark's killing. Clark's death, likewise, and the 4th precinct occupation, which I'm sure many of you remember, spurs the formation of the Twin Cities Coalition for Justice for Jamar, TCC J for J. Similarly, Damon's death in 2017 prompts the Justice for Justine group to form, although again, like CUAPB, that group is unique by not having Black and other folks of color at its helm, and instead having mostly white organizers because of the unique, because the victim was a white woman, which is fairly uncommon when we're talking about police violence locally or nationwide. All of these groups have argued that the problem in MPD is failed accountability and training and policies that facilitate police brutality. And so as a result, all of them have attempted to develop policies and platforms that would increase police accountability, particularly for police violence, particularly for lethal police violence. So TCCJ for J, for example, was, quote, formed around one demand, and that is the prosecution of Mark Ringenberg and Dustin Schwartz, who were the 2 officers who were involved in shooting and killing Jamar Clark. Only one officer shot the fatal bullet, but both of them were involved in the altercation. These groups also call for what I'm going to call, in the context of the talk, radical police reform. So for example, CUAPB's signature project was the Committee for Professional Policing. Some of you may remember this ballot initiative. They worked to get enough signatures to get a ballot initiative that would have required police to hold personal liability insurance, just like medical professionals. And the idea was that you would make officers prone to misconduct uninsurable and to foist the costs of that misconduct onto individual officers rather than onto the city for those liability for those civil suits. That measure got blocked. A court found it inconsistent with Minnesota state law, but there are attempts now to revise state law in order to make that possible. Probably won't pass with Republicans in control of the Senate, but there is work to change that. In a parallel remedy, TCCJ for J calls for Civilian Police Accountability Council, the CPAC, which would be a police oversight board that would replace the current discipline process with real civilian oversight and have elected community representatives responsible for both electing or hiring and appointing the police chief, but also disciplining officers, including firing officers for misconduct. And the group really traces the CPAC demand back to the Black Panthers' demand to, quote, end police brutality through community control of the police. So again, these are fairly radical groups who are calling for really transformative change, right? Not what we think of as kind of these like 21st century policing reforms associated with the Obama administration's task force. Of all of the recent deaths that prompted these activist groups, Justine Damon's had brought the greatest measure of something that looked like justice up until this past month, of course. It garnered a record-breaking civil and criminal sanctioning, with Noor being convicted of third-degree murder and manslaughter and a $20 million civil settlement. But in contrast, the officers who were responsible for Clark's death were not formally sanctioned. In fact, then Chief Janae Harteau said that they had done no wrong, that they had not violated any department policies. These groups also managed to get the city to, once Frey was mayor, to say that they were going to ban warrior-style police training or fear-based police training, which is one of the goals of the groups. And the very next week, of course, Bob Kroll, then head of the police union, said that he would pay for officers to attend that training, thus negating the reforms. So by 2019, these groups were starting to feel pretty discouraged. The only case that had had some kind of effective response had been Justine Damon's, and it did not escape activists that the one case where we'd gotten a criminal and civil settlement had been a case where the victim had been a white woman and the officer had been a Black or Somali American officer. So it's in this context in 2018 and 2019 that a new series of groups in Minneapolis emerged, organized not around radical police reform, but around police abolition. So this is a quote from an organizer I interviewed in 2018 about the development of these abolitionist groups. And they say, We were traumatized and doing direct actions to try and force some sort of change. But there wasn't a deep solution-oriented systemic analysis at that point. We were asking for the same things we've always been asking for, which is prosecution of the individual officers, which is additional constraints on police behavior, which is harsher police union contracts, city training, others like that. But it was, I think, after the Philando Castile shooting, really, where a lot of us started becoming very disillusioned with that sort of change methodology. And we were realizing that a lot of us burned out, and a lot of us had been beaten up by cops, maced, and fundamentally none of the pieces on the board had been moved in any deep and meaningful way. I think that people have started to radicalize themselves around that in some ways, becoming aware of the fact that reforms that we are traditionally handed don't work, and they don't change the underlying structures that are leading to the problems that we're seeing. So this sense that nothing had changed leads to this new trio of groups. MPD 150, Reclaim the Block, or RTB, and Black Visions, initially named Black Visions Collective. MPD 150 is the first group to emerge out of this organizing, and they start with a report on the 150th anniversary of the MPD, hence the name of the group. And they call it Enough is Enough, 150-year performance of the Minneapolis Police Department. And they outline the long history of police brutality in Minneapolis. And the report concludes that the roots of police brutality, corruption, and racism are in the history and founding mission of the MPD. In other words, the problem was policing as an institution, right? It wasn't just bad cops. It wasn't just failed accountability. It was the US policing system, which the report declared, quote, is not reformable. Instead, they argued that it was time to take the idea of, quote, police-free communities out of the realm of fantasy and place them firmly in the public agenda as a practical necessity. As MPD 150 really explicitly tried to focus on changing the narrative around policing and police violence, their partner organization, Reclaim the Block, began to work in 2018 on policy steps towards abolition. As one organizer reflected, quote, in 2015, I think we were very righteously angry and we were clear about the problem. Now we're clear about the solution. And that solution was to divert funding from MPD to, quote, the things that keep us safe. So this group organized a series of disruptive protests at city hall meetings, issued press releases, and mobilized supporters to participate in public testimony sessions, helping to mobilize support for the creation of the Office of Violence Prevention program, Office of Violence Prevention, OVP, in 2018, which was meant to have a public health focused model for preventing and responding to violence, and predominantly has involved trying to scale up some violence interruption programs that attempt to disrupt the cycle of violence without policing, or in parallel to policing, but through violence interrupters rather than through police. Black Visions emerges somewhat later. They really take center stage in 2020, but in this lead up period had been more quiet, had been organizing kind of more backstage. So by the time you get to 2017 to 2018 to 2019, what you're seeing is this fracture between the activist groups. So there's a set of groups that continue to fight for radical police reforms, and there's this new set of groups that are increasingly organizing for police abolition, and who have become disillusioned with the slow pace of change that the radical police reform groups have been able to accomplish. So there I want to pause and shift to how these messages were getting received in the community. Here in the community, I mean specifically in high crime, low income, heavily policed neighborhoods in North Minneapolis, not the city at large. So again, we're talking about folks who are really proximal to the problem. Okay, so some key findings from our neighborhood resident interviews. So first, consistent with national polling data, we found a wide racial consensus that police violence was a social problem. And as Monica Bell's legal estrangement theory would predict, for most Black residents, these negative attitudes about the police often came from personal or vicarious negative experiences that they or their friends and family members and loved ones had faced. Whereas for white residents, it was more often that this narrative emerged in the context of Black Lives Matter activism. So many white residents would tell us that they were newly awakened to the problem of police violence, that they were seeing what had been happening in Black communities all along, and they now were aware that, as one resident put it, quote, activists are bringing what's been happening for a long time to the public's attention, which is, police murdering Black people. So consistent with this interracial solidarity, most participants across race expressed some set of support for the kinds of reforms that were consistent with the national initiatives work that the department was actually implementing. Things like stricter use of body cameras, procedural justice, racial bias and de-escalation training, hiring officers from more underrepresented backgrounds and local communities. They also wanted to see more accountability for officers accused of misconduct in terms of officer discipline and firing, criminal charges, and greater transparency throughout the discipline process. But while MPD was doing a lot of these reforms, the public largely was unaware of that work at all. And to the extent that they were aware of that work, were quite critical of whether it was actually going to make a difference. And here too, we saw racial divides in how residents came to make sense of the problem in policing. So for many white residents, there was an attempt to minimize the problem of police violence or express ambivalence about its severity. So police violence for many white residents was the result of bad apples, for example. In contrast, Black residents were much more likely to view police violence as a dire and systemic problem. Bad apples, as the metaphor goes, had in fact spoiled the bunch. And finally, attitudes about the police were fundamentally shaped and constrained by persistent fears of crime in the community, which many residents saw police as at least one of the appropriate responses to. Okay, so for example, let me tell you the story of Teddy. Teddy was a man of color in his 30s. When we asked him about safety in the community, he immediately started talking about police. He says, I don't feel safe with the police, period, because I've been targeted too much. Police jumping out on me, violating my rights, putting my life in danger. And he would talk to us about instances of police violence nationwide and how each of those instances really, whether they were MPD or any department in the country, had really reaffirmed for him how little was changing or would change in policing. So Teddy says, the police officers down south, they killed a woman on camera. Killed a man on camera in front of the whole world. She kills him. The officer was a woman in this case. And she didn't serve no time, didn't get convicted. So why even record it? Why even have it on camera? Why even say, bring a body cam, dash camera, anything? What use is it, right? And we saw a lot of this kind of voicing of frustration about what reforms had actually achieved and what all of this spectacular violence against Black bodies that we were all being watched video after video after video was actually accomplishing. So Teddy describes whenever he sees these cases, another hashtag trending, he says, here I go again. They trying to cover up and right the wrong. They don't want to hold the officers responsible because it's somebody he killed, that don't matter. He's Black, whatever. That life don't matter, It's just a joke because it's like same old, same old. So for many residents of color, like Teddy, this focus on racism meant that for them, the solution actually lay both inside of, but also outside of policing, right? The problem wasn't just racist cops or even policing. It was racism writ large, which had produced many kinds of racial harms. Or as David, a Hispanic man in his 20s who thought police, quote, hate us, and when asked to describe who us was, he said people of color. He concluded while chuckling, I mean, it's fucked up, but we live in America. Drawing on Derek Bell's work on racial realism, which argues that racism is a persistent and fundamental feature of US society, I argue that these residents were realistic, not cynical, which is the language adopted in much of the criminological literature, but they were realistic about the failures of police reform to redress police violence. Residents of color had really divergent reactions to this realism, from disengaging with the process to settling for reform despite its limits to promoting more radical changes in public safety. So Miss Lenora, a multiracial woman in her 60s, tells us, the police think of us as animals and dogs. So until that changes, which ain't gonna happen no time soon, it's just another day, another time, because they fear our Black faces, hate our Black faces. Similarly, Rudy, a Black woman in her late 30s, told us, "We're still dying quicker than we can affect change. I don't want to be dead before I experience a neighborhood where I feel safe when the police are around. We all deserve to feel safe in our homes and in our neighborhoods. We all deserve to have, policing in our communities or ways of managing things in our communities that are like helpful and positive, that build rather than tear down and destroy." So like Rudy, about 1 in 6 residents of color that we interviewed wanted more radical changes in policing. Yet many of these residents saw fair and just policing as part of the end goal. While a couple of residents articulated something that looked closer to the abolitionist vision, more commonly, police still played a role in their imagining of the future, but it would be a police force unrecognizable to today's residents, right? It would end policing as we know it and create a new kind of policing, which more recently has been described as anti-racist policing. And this ambivalence about policing and the future of police was in part because residents saw the persistently high rates of street crime and and community and gender-based violence as another manifestation of racism or structural racism, and a problem that police were at least somewhat helpful in responding to. So residents wanted police to take their concerns seriously and address violent crime in the community, rather than what they perceived as harassing residents for petty offenses and treating everybody indiscriminately in the neighborhood as criminals. And finally, like the first group of radical reformers, people in the community often had really strong feelings of wanting officer accountability for misconduct. So Marcel, a Black man in his late 50s, declared, "The laws should matter all the time for police officers, for civilians, for everybody. But instead there are your standards for whites, your standards for people of color, and then there's the police standards. Police violate every one of their standards, but they're never held accountable for it." Okay, so with that, I want to pause and say that's sort of taking us up to 2019, right? So you have increasing awareness among residents that police violence is a systemic problem, but you have different definitions on how severe the problem is, and how much of it is a policing problem versus a problem more generally about racism that has a lot of different tentacles. And that brings us to 2020, right? And the murder of George Floyd. So as I'm sure you likely all remember being local, within about 2 weeks of the killing of George Floyd, a majority of the what was called a veto-proof majority of the city council held an event at Powderhorn Park, pictured here on the slide. The event was organized and pushed by the Black Visions Collective group, who had put tremendous pressure on city council leaders to declare a more radical vision of what should happen with the MPD in wake of George Floyd's murder. So those city council members stood on a stage emblazoned, as many of you I'm sure remember, with these words, "Defund police." They read this statement that in many ways was cribbed straight from the MPD 150 report and included much of the same language and phrasing. And the MPD and the activists, the city council members declared, echoing the language of the activists, that MPD was not reformable, and instead that they were promising to end the MPD and to build a new model of safety for the community. Yet, echoing the debates among the anti-police violence activists in recent years, the details on what dismantle or end the MPD actually meant seem to vary pretty substantially across the different city council members who stood on the stage. And that varied from a real abolitionist vision of getting rid of policing altogether to a vision of rebuilding the police force under the same chief, but using this process to break the union, essentially, or what was known as the Newark model in that moment of contestation. Eventually, the proposal that garnered the most support and came closest to dismantling the department was a proposed charter amendment that would go up for public vote, which would replace the MPD with a Department of Community Safety and Violence Prevention. As I think you probably all know, again, being local, that amendment was blocked by the City Charter Commission, who ran out the clock on their review period on it, and then later suggested rejecting the amendment. But it's back up this year in two different forms. First, as a City Council initiated item, and then second, as a popular petition. The popular petition has gotten enough votes to go on the ballot. So the expectation now is that the City Council is likely to remove their petition. At the same time, though, that we will likely in November 2020 vote on this charter amendment to replace the MPD with a Department of Public Safety. There's also potentially going to be an amendment about creating more of a strong mayor model, which puts even more departments under the direct control of the mayor, and which would go against the charter amendment, which one of the things that it does, in addition to renaming and reorienting the department, it puts control of the department under the City Council rather than under the mayor. So it's potential that we could have two charter amendments that kind of directly contradict one another, in addition to seeing a number of, well, all of the City Council members who stood on that stage are up for re-election, some of them fighting pretty tough competitors who are slamming them for this declaration and for moving too quickly on this, and not critiques that they haven't taken violent crime seriously enough in this process of reimagining the police. So resistance to the charter amendment has been fierce. Initially, there was debate about whether the new department would involve armed police officers at all written into the charter amendment. So that, of course, was stoked as fears that the charter amendment would lead immediately to abolition. It is designed as a charter amendment that lets us move closer to abolition by removing the number of police officers required out of the city charter. So the mayor, together with many business interests and city charter commissions and other white elites in the city, have often argued in this past year that the problem of police violence is again a bad apples issue that can be solved by supporting Chief Arredondo with more reform and better accountability measures, echoing many of the white participants in our Northside study. A group of residents in North Minneapolis led by a former city council member and very prominent Black activist in Northside is also suing the department, saying that they've failed to protect the community in this past year. And surprisingly, a number of the more radical reform anti-police violence activist groups came out against the charter amendment as well, arguing not so much that the charter amendment itself was necessarily the problem, but arguing that it wouldn't solve anything, that all it would do is put more control behind the city council, which they saw as really failing to address police violence in the years that had preceded the murder of George Floyd. So there's increasingly support among Black civil rights and community leaders, often of a more senior generation, for what they've started calling anti-racist policing that would address both community violence and police violence. But there's also, of course, more support, particularly among younger members of the community across race, for a more abolitionist vision of really taking power and resources away from the police department and building other kinds of ways of preventing and responding to harm. Finally, the radical police reform groups are still fighting for the same proposals that they've suggested all along, including police liability insurance, including the CPAC, and including civilian negotiation or civilian involvement in police union negotiation. Okay, so let me wrap up. I've been going for a while here. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm like in Google Slides, and I downloaded it into PowerPoint. And when I do that, it ruins the slide. 1 second. I'll show you the slide prettier. Somebody's unmuted, by the way. I can just hear your breathing, so it's not really a problem. But if anybody sees that they're unmuted, somebody is. Okay, so to conclude, I think where we're at in this moment is there are a number of different, what scholars call diagnostic and prognostic frames about police violence and the path forward that both complicate and illuminate the challenges facing us. So there's a group that sees the problem primarily as racism in policing and outside of policing, which would suggest that the answer is anti-racism, right? Outside of and inside of policing. There's also a group arguing that the problem is around hiring and training, right? That would suggest that the solution is police reform, right? That we never really had a chance to fully implement the 21st century task force policing report because the work was interrupted in part by national leadership changing in 2016. Some people define the problem as accountability, particularly these radical reform groups, and say that we need these really transformational changes in how we respond to police misconduct and lethal police violence. And then finally, the abolitionists argue that the problem isn't all of these other things. The problem is policing, right? And at root, capitalism or racial capitalism and the structure of our society altogether, which produces these unjust outcomes. And so for them, the answer is often abolition and a move towards a different economic model that produces more racial and class justice. So from my point of view, I think that all of these different diagnoses of the problem and solutions highlight important facets of what I think is a really complicated policy conundrum. And so I think all of them suggest that we have work to do at a lot of different levels, right? That these are actually in some ways complementary visions, right? That all of these things need to change, right? So we need to transform society, right? The fact that we have high rates of street crime in predominantly low income communities of color is ultimately wrapped up with our long history of race and class discrimination. And so empowering those communities and bringing up the power and the quality of life in those communities will by itself, right, resolve some of these issues around both crime and police violence. We also need to transform policing. For the past 30 years, we have militarized our police as we have asked them to go tougher and tougher, quote unquote, on crime, leading to a massive wave of criminalization, arrest records, and criminal records for a whole generation, especially burdensome for young men of color. And we've largely let police officers be immune from any consequences for police violence. But I think we also, the abolitionists are absolutely right to say that we need to build alternatives to police, right? We don't need to have armed police officers responding to all kinds of crises in the community. And I think attempts to build out alternative responses to people who are unhoused, to people experiencing mental health crises, to domestic violence incidents and domestic violence victims, I think all of that is long overdue. So for folks who are interested, my team recently produced a report with Cura Reporter that you can see a little image here of on the screen. It's very easy to Google and pull up the link. We have a little bit more specifics on what we recommend in terms of police reform in the report. And so for folks who are interested, I encourage you to check that out. Okay, so here I want to just quickly say I'm at Phelps at umn.edu. Happy, of course, to take questions for the next 20 minutes, but also happy to be in touch with any of you over email and in different ways. I also want to thank all of the project funders, all of whom who have been at the University of Minnesota, including Cura, including the Grant and Aid program, including the McNair program, the Sociology department, and UROC over in Northside. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming, and I welcome your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Phelps. And feel free, everybody, to, if you want to unmute and ask questions, or feel free to put them in chat as well, and we can get those up.
I want to say something first. I want to thank you for such an amazing presentation and report. It's so amazing to see this, and these are difficult times. I think for the first time I am seeing that people are referring more to the BIPOC suffering, because a lot of times people think it's only certain communities or certain genders or certain people who get affected by this. And I have repeated it several times. I have been stabbed 7 times in the same car my husband drives, and he's white. And most times I am super afraid about what is happening. And this means that I even have a car. I cannot imagine people who don't even can acquire a car. So supposedly I am a little more privileged, or because I'm Hispanic, I am not in the group of the people who are affected, supposedly, but these situations. So I am glad to see that people are including the rest of us who are minorities inside minorities. The, our suffering is not even in mind of anyone, because there are other groups that are, I don't know, bigger and have suffered a lot and have been more visible in the pain, but it still doesn't take away from the pain that others have during these times. So I'm very thankful that you presented this, and this is very painful to hear. And when you mentioned the conversations with the community where people say, this is the life here in America, I totally agree with that. This has been my life in America. And I refuse to think that all Americans are the same. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And yeah, I think there's, there's a way, I've thought a lot about the way that the movement has, so first of all, there's a lot written on sort of like who gets included in this and who doesn't, and why is it that we're focusing particularly on Black men and boys who are killed by the police when the problem is broader than that. And I think part of the reason that we get that focus is because that is the group that has the highest sort of just like risk prevalence profile. But I think we really lose some of that texture and sort of solidarity across different groups when we focus on the statistics of it, right? The statistics reveal something really important about the prevalence, right, and the frequency of these things. But part of the reason you get the like say her name campaign is to say it's not just men, it's women, right? And similarly, indigenous groups and other people of color also face elevated rates of police violence and this like targeting for suspicious persons, right, in vehicles. And those vehicle stops were really pervasive in our data. People talked about how they didn't want their young men in particular, sons and partners, to be driving, particularly in cars with other young men of color. People were really aware of the risk of stops in vehicles because of these pretext stops. And we've seen that, of course, tragically in the killing of Dante Wright just last week. And I think that's one of the places where we can really think about reimagining the police instead of reforming the police. Is I don't think there's any reason for police to be doing all of these pretext stops. I think the idea that they solve crime is not at all supported by data, and they create a tremendous amount of harm because they create a whole set of community members who feel like second-class citizens because driving becomes criminalized. And I'm really encouraged that there's some movement both locally and at the state level to really try to rein in police departments' ability to stop drivers, because I think that's an incredibly important part of this story that kind of got lost a bit over the past year. I think one of the problems with having a movement that's so focused on these like particular instances is like each time there's a particular instance of lethal police violence that's particularly horrific, everybody focuses on the details of that case in particular. And there's an attempt to kind of individualize each case, but they're not individual, right? The unique circumstances may vary for each one, but they're tied to this broader pattern. And I think we need to keep our eyes on the prize of like, what is this broader system? How do we change it? And where can we get the most leverage in those changes? Whether it or not, it sort of lines up with the like latest instance of the horror. And the last thing I want to say about your comments is, I didn't talk about it much in this talk, but we have a whole paper in collaboration with Amber Joy Powell. She's the first author on this paper that looks at particularly women of color's experiences. And in line with the sort of Say Her Name campaign, women of color often feel like they've been rendered invisible in this process because it's been so focused on men, and women face really unique risks in the community, including gender-based violence, and then feel worried about calling the police when they're experiencing gender-based violence because of what police might do to their partners and family members and loved ones. And women often experience direct criminalization, like getting stopped in vehicles. And yet, when they were worried about police violence, they often were worried about partners and sons. They weren't giving their daughters, in many cases, the same talk. And so in this kind of perverse way, they were also kind of subsuming their own pain because of these same reasons, right? And I think that was really tragic to me, and something that I think is really important, that like we can't just focus on the numbers, right? It has to be about the broader phenomenon and how it affects so many of us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Phelps. And on behalf of you and your whole team, I really appreciate and really thank you for all the research that you guys have done. I'm a Black man who has lived all my life in North Minneapolis. And I was gonna say, even though I've always wanted to say this and I've never actually gotten involved or in things of this kind, I've always wanted to tell my story. My story could have been, I could have been George Floyd. Early in the 90s, I left my house. I was over on Humboldt Avenue and Highway 55. And as I was driving, probably not even a block away from my house, a police stopped me and I gave my driver's license and insurance. I just want to tell my story because I haven't been able to tell it because I have had to shut down, and until all this recent issues and things like this has come up. This is my first time actually even telling my story. And I, watched the verdict yesterday, and I got up early this morning and I prayed and I said to myself, this could have been me. George Floyd could have been me. And what happened, as far as, continuing with my story, a block away from my house on Humboldt, I was stopped by a police, and I gave them my driver's license and gave them my insurance. And the police, went back, checked everything was okay, and came back with my driver's license and a ticket. I refused, even though I was sitting in my car, I refused to take the ticket. And he gave me my driver's license, and then he threw the ticket inside my car and said, "Sir, you're in the street and I need you to move." And I basically said, at least you could treat me with a little respect. That, by me even just saying that, this police pulled me out of the car, threw my head on the concrete, and rubbed my face all over the pavement to a point where I was so shocked that it happened so quick. All I could say is, please, I'm sorry. What did I do? I'm sorry. And he said, pull your hand behind your back. He already pulled my hand behind my back. He already cuffed me. And I said, what else can I do? I was so shocked. It took me by surprise. By the time he pulled me up, my whole face was bleeding. My whole left side of my face was bleeding. And then he took me to jail, towed my car. And I was so shocked about the whole situation. The people at the jail, started apologizing, and he told that the police told them, treat him nice, and I didn't know what that meant. But eventually they took the ticket. They didn't have me pay anything, but I couldn't report it because I wasn't sure that if anyone was going to believe me. This was the time where there was no a camera on their body. And like I said, until today, this is my first time I'm actually telling my story. But then after the verdict yesterday and just going over this, I said, I could have been George Floyd. So with all your research, I thank you very much for you and your team, because this is real and this is really happening. We are enduring police brutality. And I mean, this is even, I mean, I'm from Nigeria, and this is even much worse than I've seen. And I've seen a lot of cases. And my story just ended like that, with me having to go and just take care of myself without actually having to be able to report it, having to be able to say anything about it. So I'm just glad that these things are coming out and people are seeing the light of how Black men have been treated all our life. I mean, now I stay in Medina, which is a suburb, and even when I drive and I see a police officer behind me, I'm praying, I'm scared. I don't even know how to react. There are times where I would just pull to the side and, you know, as if I was already arrested. Then if you go past me, I'm praying, saying, thank God it didn't stop me. So it's a reality, it's a real thing that we are actually facing. I mean, I can tell you more other stories, but I'll keep it short, and because there might be other people that might want to say their piece as well. But I just want to thank you, and hopefully with your research, we can get something out of this and we can write books. My wife is she's a teacher, and she's also working towards things of the BIPAC, you know, advocating for people. And I just wanted to commend you guys for the work that you do. Thank you very much. I pray for United States and for every woman and man, because we are all equal. And I hope that justice could be served for a lot more other people. And I hope this doesn't continue or doesn't keep happening, because it has to stop and it has to end. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Thank
so much
thank you for sharing that.
your
Yeah.
story.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Very powerful, very powerful. We do have some other questions, it looks like. I think Virajita, looks like you have a question.
Thank you. I just wanted to also say, Kwan, thank you for sharing the story. I'm glad this space felt, created a space for you to share that.
Thank you.
Dr. Phelps, I am so incredibly impressed and excited by your work. I had the opportunity to attend the teach-in this earlier, and I have to say that, we didn't know what the verdict was, but even that conversation gave sort of language, context, and sort of constructed meanings, to kind of navigate what was ahead. So I thank you for your work and the work of all the incredible activists and community members in this area. So one of the things I also feel is that your work demonstrates that we at the university have some unique perspectives and tools to make sense of this, as you have, with all that is happening. And it's so helpful on this morning, especially to look back. I'm interested in two things. One is that you referred to what was not only a Black Lives movement, but where there were white voices as well, kind of coming to the table and building it, which has been historically true with the civil rights movement and so on. So I'm interested in your observations there and what we can learn, especially since we are a predominantly white institution here. And then that leads me to the second part of my question, is that what can we learn from what you're seeing in the community for the university context? And in your teaching, you referred to this campuses as relatively tranquil spaces where these conversations can happen. We have struggled to have been able to, so we thank you also for that. In our committee, we've struggled to get people to discuss this from the different parts of public safety, to have these conversations with us in this conference. So any insights would be very helpful. Thank you again.
Sure. Yeah. And thank you for coming to the teach-in. I'm glad it was helpful. That's always nice to hear that these things are helpful to folks, 'cause that's why we put them on. And it was a little scary to talk to a crowd of 400 people while the jurors were deliberating. Anyhow, yeah, on the white solidarity thing. I mean, I think it's really tricky. I think white folks can't stay silent on all of this, but there's also a way in which like white folks can take over the conversation instead of kind of passing the mic, and figuring out when you're doing the one versus the other is really complicated. And yes, we are a predominantly white institution and we're a predominantly white state, less so in Minneapolis, although we're still a predominantly white city, but certainly Minnesota more broadly is a very predominantly white state. And so it will take both white leadership to be on board with some of this stuff, and it will also take white voters being willing to say yes to this, right? And to encourage and enable Black and Indigenous and people of color who are running for these positions of power, right, to hire them. And I think one of the real challenges when we think about the state level is the way that the like Minneapolis story has created such different lessons for people who are local and in the city versus people who are watching from the suburbs and the out of metro areas of the state. I mean, I think, you know, when I think about what happened last summer, I think about how incredible it is, how many of my friends just in the community, you know, I have 2 young kids, so I have a lot of mom friends, and like most of whom are white. And, you know, those folks are suddenly posting about police violence in a way that they just hadn't been engaged with, and police abolition, right? All my friends are suddenly abolitionists. Which I think is really powerful, but I also like worry a little bit when people who never have to call the cops, who have never interacted with police officers, who have white children who they don't worry about interaction with police officers. I worry when those folks are dominating the conversation, right? And particularly when they're dominating the conversation and saying, well, I'm doing this for Black people. And it's like, well, like which Black people, and like who are you actually talking to, and who are you lifting up? So anyways, I think the allyship thing is, and I don't even love the word ally particularly. Some people prefer comrade, some people prefer other terminology, but anyways, it's complicated but important. And I think the most important thing is to show that this isn't isolated incidences, right? This is a pattern. This is a broader trend. But I think, right, I sort of lost my train of thought there, but to go back to what Minneapolis is learning versus the rest of the state. I mean, I think the rest of the state watched the unrest in Minneapolis, and the lesson they learned was, you know, the city is ungovernable and dangerous, and we need to throw more and more law enforcement at the problem. And so we're in this really complicated moment where I think the left is more and more on board with really radical changes in all of this, and the right is kind of reconfirming or doubling down on like kind of a defensive law and order position that sees the protests in response to police violence as more of a problem than the police violence itself. So it's a really complicated moment. On the campus policing stuff, I'm sure there are folks, yourself included, who are really actively a part of that conversation right now. I haven't been actively a part, you know, most of my research is on city policing, not campus policing. But I do think our students are really calling for some transformational changes on campus. And I think it would be a real waste of an opportunity not to listen to those calls and not try to model how we could do some of this better, and how we could think about really reimagining what it means to have police on campus.
Thank you, Dr. Phelps. We're running up on the time, and we could probably talk about this all morning. So thank you for the engagement. We have a couple people who wanted to ask questions. It looks like Amelius is up next. And as I indicated in the chat, feel free to throw questions in the chat. And Dr. Phelps, if you're open to it, we can forward these to you afterwards for additional follow-up.
Michelle, thank you very much for your presentation and the issues. A statement and then a question. I think one of the things I like about your presentation is it acknowledges that lots of people who really care about this issue can have different views, that you have people who think radical reform is the way to go, and no one would say that they are in the pocket of the police department. And then you have people who want to abolish policing, you know, and so I think it's important that you know, people who deeply care can have different opinions. Because so much of this, what we hear with social media is about hashtags. So defund the police, abolish the police. Just a quick question in the defund space. For the people who are actually working on that and trying to move that forward, you know, the idea that you cut police budgets by a lot and you give that money to social programs and housing and education, are there conversations about a bridge? Meaning cutting a police department $50 million and putting that money in housing doesn't automatically deal with the issues that police might legitimately have to respond to when you have unhoused people, or doesn't immediately give young people jobs so they don't steal cars. You know, is part of the, not the social media conversation around defunding the police, but the actual policy piece of it. Is there talk of like how we bridge from what we're currently doing to more of a prevention and dealing with the issues that may result in crime in different ways?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that question. And I appreciate your comment about people who care very deeply about these issues. I mean, I think, you know, social media is the worst in a lot of ways, but I think one of the things that it's done is it's really like, it's kind of flattened the discourse around, like, you often have these conversations online where it's like, well, if you don't 100% agree with me, then you're like, you know, basically this is all empty symbolic gesturing and you're a bad faith actor, right? And I think it is important to acknowledge that, like, policing is really complicated. You know, for some people, police represent only state repression and state violence. And for some people, they represent protection and safety and this idea that the police are responding to their needs. And for some people, it's both, depending on which officer, in which context, on which day. And it makes it a really tricky and thorny problem to untangle, right? When the very people that are called upon to protect us are the same people that are harming us. And the us being a really disproportionate burden depending on what community you're in. On the question around defunding and sort of what is the actual policy of it? I mean, you know, activists have been talking about something like defunding for a long time, even though that hashtag or that banner word is pretty common. And I think we're only now seeing cities and I would say, I was going to say states, but not really. I don't think any state has like meaningfully done something on defunding, but we've seen left-leaning cities start to experiment with this. And I think there's just going to be a lot of different experiments and a lot of different cities doing it differently. And we're going to want to study how it works and which models seem to work and in which context. And I do think that there's this tension between thinking about prevention as like kind of a root causes approach, like, you know, at the kind of extreme end of that, I think is if we think about education reform as part of this story, like we're thinking about like altering a whole like generations kind of educational experience from K through 12, right? Like that's going to take a very long time to pay off. Whereas there are other kind of root causes approaches that I think are more short term. So for example, we know from studies of the ACA and the expansion of healthcare that providing healthcare that addresses people's substance use disorders reduces crime on the same time scale and at the same dollar for dollar investments that increases in police departments do. So that's an example of something where like you are interrupting it right now, right? Violence interrupters, similarly, they're meant to work in the here and now. You know, I think some of the stuff around housing gets a little bit trickier because, you know, police are called to interact with unhoused people a lot, but unhoused people are not doing like a majority of the crime. And there's a lot of unhoused people. So like to really create affordable and sustainable housing for everybody will cost a tremendous amount of money and won't necessarily have that much of a dip on what police are actually doing. In contrast, having like really well-funded, well-deployed 24/7 across the city mental health crisis units that actually reduce the call, that may actually meaningfully reduce the calls that police get in a way where we could reduce the funding of police departments. So I think sometimes one of my quibbles with some of the ways that abolition gets framed in some activist circles is this idea that we've spent so much money on police that if we just divested from police, we would solve all these social problems. The reality is that the reason we invest in policings and jails and prisons and probation and parole is because it's actually a relatively cheap way to manage what are very deep social problems, really giving everybody access to affordable housing, really giving everybody access to quality education, really making sure nobody goes hungry in our country. Those are expensive, right? Because they involve massive numbers of people, only a small percentage of whom are coming into contact with law enforcement typically. And so, I think we need to think about not just defunding, but also like, how do we raise taxes, right? How do we create more of support for progressive policies and shift our money into not just supporting folks, but really rethinking what the social safety net looks like. And we're not going to get there just by taking 50% of police departments' budgets. And we're not going to get there at the city level either. Like, that's going to require state level funding, and it's going to require nation level funding, because cities have a problem that if they go too far in policy preferences outside of what their tax base prefers, the tax base will leave, right? Cities are jurisdictionally bounded that way. And so cities can't do this on their own. And so it's really like a much deeper, more structural issue to really redress all of those problems. But I do think that when we talk about that, it can get kind of defeatist. I do think there are short-term interventions with relatively small pockets of money that could make a big difference too. So I know I'm over time. So I just wanted to say thank you, everybody, for having me. And I really appreciate the questions and comments, and happy to be in touch with anybody moving forward.